Clear line 29 left. We're going to make an early turn. Got a little bit of surging on the engine.
379er, approved as requested, either left or right turn.
We're turning left downwind, and we're going to make a clear approach.
Wind 5, runway 29 left, clear to land.
We just lost our engine.
Cessna 379er, can you land on the road over there? Cessna 379er. Baja 26, do you see anything over there?
Tower, I got the plane. Looks like it hit a parked, getting to send an ambulance right underneath. There's a couple people outside, but it looks like it hit a parked semi-trailer here by this vacant lot.
That accident occurred on Thursday at the Stockton, California airport, where I do a lot of training, and I'm happy to report that the two San Joaquin County Sheriff's Office deputies who were flying a training exercise in a Cessna 206 were uninjured. And you heard how fast they went from rough engine to a complete engine failure. So if you ever get a rough engine, turn immediately toward a suitable field, as you may not have much time before you have a total engine failure. Our thanks to liveatc.net for the audio. Hello again, and welcome back to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots like you to help keep you safe when you fly. I'm Max Trescott. For our main topic today, we'll be talking about deadly propeller accidents, which happen more often than you might think. And we have listener questions, including one from a new private pilot who asked about what next steps he should be taking toward getting an instrument rating, plus much, much more. By the way, if you have thought about maybe someday buying a Cirrus SR20, SR22, or SF50 Vision Jet, or you would like flight training in one, hey, I'm your guy. Give me a call, 650-967-2500 for a free consultation and possibly a free demo flight. I specialize in the Cirrus, and I work with people around the world. Last week in episode 124, we gave an overview on the kinds of accidents that continue to occur to general aviation pilots. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. This week in the news, the NTSB releases a preliminary report on that deadly crash of a B-17 in Connecticut. If you fly with BasicMed, there's a new country you can now go to. And finally, we have an uplifting story about what an airline captain did on his final flight before retirement. All this and more, and the news starts now. From AOPA.org, the preliminary NTSB report on the fatal crash of a Boeing B-17 in Connecticut includes evidence that the aircraft may have had trouble with more than one of its four engines. 7 people, including the pilot, co-pilot, and 5 passengers, died in that crash when the aircraft crashed 1,000 feet short of Bradley International Airport as the crew was attempting to return. The ill-fated flight of the World War II bomber never left the traffic pattern or climbed more than 400 feet above the ground, according to the NTSB preliminary report. The flight departed at 9:47 a.m. with 3 crew members and 10 passengers aboard. One of the pilots requested a return to the airport within 3 minutes, and the crew reported a rough mag on the number 4 engine and acknowledged a landing clearance from the tower moments later. At that time, the airplane was about 300 feet AGL on a midfield right downwind leg for runway 6. The tower controller inquired about the flight's progress back to the runway, and the pilot responded that we were, quote, getting there. There were no further communications. Witnesses and airport surveillance cameras confirmed the aircraft struck approach lights about 1,000 feet short of the runway, then hit the ground about 500 feet short of the runway. It continued onto the runway's surface before veering right, crossing a grassy area and striking vehicles and a de-icing fluid storage tank. The aircraft was largely destroyed in the post-crash fire. The report suggests the crew may have been trying to cope with trouble in 2 engines, not just one. Propellers attached to the number 3 and number 4 engines were found with blades in the feathered or partially feathered positions. The number 3 engine was recovered from the top of the de-icing fluid tank, and one blade was impact damaged and near the feather position. The other 2 blades appeared in a position between low pitch and feather. One propeller blade exhibited a 5-inch tip separation, and the separated tip sections were recovered from 100 feet and 700 feet from the main wreckage. The number 4 engine was recovered from the de-ice building. All 3 propeller blades on the number 4 engine appeared to be in the feather position. A fuel sample recovered from one of 2 fuel tanks supplying the number 3 engine was found to be free of contamination. There is no mention of fuel testing or contamination that might have affected any of the other engines. At the time of the aircraft's most recent inspection on January 16th, 3 of the 4 engines had 0 hours since major overhaul. The number 4 engine had 838 hours since its last major overhaul. The report also noted that the inspection of the wreckage determined that jack screws, which actuate the flaps, were found in a position consistent with the flaps being retracted. So the report is essentially consistent with an eyewitness report which said that the number 3 engine had been feathered, and with the pilot's report on the tower frequency that he was having trouble with the number 4 engine. I can only imagine that with 2 engines out on the same wing that this must have been incredibly difficult to control. We'll probably learn more from the final NTSB report, though that's probably at least 12 to 18 months away. From MyModernMet.com, flight operated entirely by women flies 120 young girls to NASA. Did you know that only about 7% of U.S.-based pilots are women? Though low, the number is fortunately on the rise, thanks in part to equality awareness efforts by Delta Airlines. On October 5th, for the past 5 years, the airline has marked International Girls in Aviation Days with its WING, or Women Inspiring Our Next Generation flight, a program that aims to inspire girls to pursue careers in aviation. This year's WING flight flew 120 girls between the ages of 12 and 18 from Salt Lake City to Houston. Fittingly, the flight was operated entirely by women, from the pilots and onboard crew to the air traffic controllers and ramp agents, a move that illustrates WING's mission. We know representation matters, Beth Poole, the GM of Pilot Development, says. At Delta, we believe you have to see it to be it. A plane full of professionals is not all that the WING's aspiring aviators saw. Once they landed in Houston, they were invited to 4 NASA sites: the Mission Control Center, Building 9, Johnson Space Center, and Space Center Houston, a Smithsonian affiliate museum. On top of exclusive tours of the premises, the girls were offered meet and greets with mentors from the male-dominated aviation work groups, including lunch with Jeanette Epps, an astronaut and aerospace engineer. By introducing these students to the inner workings of NASA, and most importantly to the women who help make it all possible, Delta aims to show girls and young women interested in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, that the sky's the limit. And fortunately, it seems they're on the right path. And here's a quote from Caitlin J. She's one of the 17-year-old WING participants. She said, quote, "It didn't really seem realistic to go after a career in aviation, but today I realized, hey, I can do this too." Very cool. So congratulations to Delta and all the young ladies that participated in that flight. From FlyingMag.com, NASA's first all-electric aircraft delivered for testing. The X-57 will be NASA's first crewed X-plane in 2 decades. Now, on October 14th, 1947, the Bell X-1 launched from the bomb bays of a Boeing B-29 at 7,000 feet, piloted by Chuck Yeager, to become the first airplane to fly faster than the speed of sound. As we mark the 72nd anniversary of that flight today, NASA adds another X-plane to that historic series of aircraft. Now, by the way, before I continue with the story, just think in your mind what this X aircraft might look like. I'm sure you're thinking of the X-1, the X-15, all these famous X-planes. And why are we talking about this on a general aviation podcast? Well, this X-plane, the X-57, is a highly modified Technim P2006T aircraft with electric cruise motors, and it's been delivered to NASA's Armstrong Flight Research Crew Center in Edwards, California, to become the X-57. Now, if you're not familiar with it, this aircraft is an incredibly low-cost-to-operate light twin, and it's very much a general aviation aircraft. The airplane was delivered by Empirical Systems Aerospace in the first of 3 configurations as an all-electric aircraft known as Modification 2 or Mod 2. The delivery is a major milestone for the project, allowing NASA engineers to begin putting the aircraft through ground test, to be followed by taxi test and eventually flight test. A goal of the X-57 project is to help develop certification standards for emerging electric aircraft markets, including urban air mobility vehicles, which also rely on complex distributed electric propulsion systems. NASA will share the aircraft's electric propulsion-focused design and airworthiness process with regulators in industry, which will advance certification approaches for aircraft utilizing distributed electric propulsion. From avweb.com, an R-22 has been converted for unmanned crop dusting. Aerial application solutions company UA Voss announced that it has converted a Robinson R-22 UV helicopter for use as an unmanned agricultural drone. In addition to the modifications necessary for remote control, the R-22-UV Agro drone has been equipped with a 100-liter, that's 26-gallon, tank and spray system for liquid chemical delivery. According to the company, the aircraft has an endurance of approximately 2 hours. Quote, the R-22-UV can be operated in the regions without airfields under severe weather conditions and during nighttime in the conditions with a high probability of risk for the pilot, said UA Voss. Unlike heavy machinery, which cannot go into a field immediately after heavy rain, UAV has no impact on the ground. UAVs can also enable growers to spray their crops precisely and at will, which is critical for fighting herbicide-resistant weeds. And why do we talk about that? Well, if they can automate a helicopter to be flown by itself, yeah, you can just imagine big airplanes are next. And hey, guess what? Here's a story from AvWeb. Embraer tests autonomous aircraft. Embraer announced that it has successfully completed the first test of an autonomous aircraft in Brazil. By the way, I've seen the video. It's a Legacy 500, which is essentially a large business jet. As shown in the video, the taxi test, which was overseen by a pilot in the cockpit, took the aircraft along a previously established path without human interference. According to Embraer, an integrated artificial intelligence system capable of acting independently on acceleration, steering, and braking monitored the aircraft's external and internal conditions. Quote, our strategy for technology development in autonomous systems seeks to position the country at the forefront of artificial intelligence processes in a variety of applications, said VP of Engineering and Technology Daniel Moxdweller. Achieving this technical milestone in Embraer's 50th anniversary month demonstrated not only the importance of bringing industry closer to the university, but also how prepared and engaged our people are for the journey of excellence needed for the coming decades. So, folks, I think that sometime in our lifetimes, we're going to see automated large aircraft, probably starting with the cargo airliners. Also from avweb.com, the world's largest general aviation aircraft just got sold. There's a new owner for Stratolaunch. Space launch solutions company Stratolaunch has been sold, according to an announcement made last Friday. The future of Stratolaunch has been uncertain since the death of founder Paul Allen in 2018, with the report surfacing last June that the company might be closed after unsuccessful attempts to sell it. The identity of the new owner and the details of the transaction have not been released. As previously reported by AvWeb, Stratolaunch's aerial launch platform flew for the first time last April. The 6-engine Stratolaunch aircraft, which has a wingspan of 385 feet, was a joint project with Scaled Composites. It was designed to carry payloads of up to 500,000 pounds to altitudes around 35,000 feet for launch. And I think this is actually the world's largest aircraft at this point. So great to hear that it's going to continue on with a new company. In light sport news from kitplanes.com, Chipper Aerospace is up for sale. Following a fire earlier this year that destroyed much of the company's inventory and tooling, by the way, that's a story we covered here, James and Kathy Weeb have decided they cannot continue operating the Chipper aircraft side of the business and are offering it for sale. In a message on the Chipper website, James and Kathy explained, our business insurance has provided us with a partial payback on what we owned. We did not receive enough insurance proceeds to continue to operate. We did not have business interruption insurance. The life savings of James and Kathy were invested in the business, and it is gone now without recovery. Therefore, James is focused on creating current and future income through electronics work. We prioritize insurance proceeds to pay the debts of the business and, to the best of our abilities, the obligations to our customers. For more information, visit the Chipper site at www.chipper, that's CHIPPER.aero. So here's an opportunity for someone if they're interested in getting into the light sport aircraft business. In international news from AustralianFlying.com, airports are our biggest problem, says AOPA Australia. AOPA Australia CEO Ben Morgan, who we interviewed on the show last year, has labeled threatened airport closures as the largest problem facing GA in Australia today. Speaking at a seminar at AusFly, Morgan said that dealing with municipal airport owners was a greater issue than tackling the regulators. Quote, I actually think that CASA has become a secondary problem over the years. There is a growing trend right now that local councils are making decisions that airports are not needed anymore. Right now, we are battling 27 local councils over 27 airports that are at risk of closure, and it's a really difficult fight. The largest argument is the argument of risk, and a lot of this has come up in the last year after CASA reworked CASR Part 139, which is aerodrome regulations. CASA has a framework of standards for registered aerodromes, and those regulations are so extreme that many local councils are thinking they can't meet the standard. Their initial reaction is if they can't meet the standard for a registered airport, then there's a liability issue and they're going to be sued. Councils have no understanding that an airport can be run as an ALA quite successfully and the risk can be managed more easily. Our frustration is that we know that from an industry perspective, ALAs can be virtually anywhere, and the pilot in command takes the decision to land, so the pilot takes on the liability to decide if the airport is suitable for them to take off and land. Our engagement with councils over the past has not been effective, he admitted. It's taken a number of years to learn how to be an effective advocate, to battle councillors' local government mentality, and to support the local community. There was an aha moment about 2 years ago when we realized that they weren't aviation people and we had to start at the very bottom with them, get in there and build up their general knowledge. We're trying to take a more inclusive approach and partner with the councils, trying to reinforce the relationship and get airport advisory committees set up. Through that process, we've been able to work with GMs and CEOs and airport managers so they understand there are ways to mitigate and manage the risk. In the last 6 months, we've become much more effective, and we've been able to get to a situation where local councils have decided to close airports and not renew leases, and we've been able to turn that around. Morgan cited Gympie in Queensland and Georgetown in Tasmania as airports where AOPA had wins at airports threatened with closure or inappropriate development. And if you were wondering what ALA stands for, I looked it up. It's an aircraft landing area, and that's separate from an aerodrome or AD, so apparently two different classes of airports in Australia. From AOPA.org, Mexico welcomes pilots flying under BasicMed. Pilots flying under BasicMed will be able to travel to Mexico in their aircraft starting December 10th under a policy letter signed by Mexico's Directorate General of Civil Aeronautics on October 11th. In recognizing BasicMed, Mexico joins the Bahamas as a BasicMed-friendly destination. The Bahamas recognized BasicMed soon after the new form of aviation medical qualification took effect in May 2017. Today, more than 51,000 U.S. pilots are safely flying under the BasicMed program, which requires pilots who have previously passed a third-class medical to take an online medical education course and then go to a state-licensed physician for the required BasicMed physical exam. Mexico's welcome for BasicMed pilots comes as good news for GA on both sides of the border because Mexico is the most popular international destination for U.S. pilots, accounting for more than 30% of international GA flights, said Craig Spence, Secretary General of the International Council of Aircraft Owner and Pilot Associations. BasicMed allows eligible pilots to fly aircraft authorized to carry up to 6 occupants and with a maximum certificated takeoff weight of no more than 6,000 pounds. Pilots can fly up to 250 knots indicated airspeed and up to 18,000 feet. A pilot in command operating under BasicMed must have a comprehensive medical examination using an FAA-approved medical examination checklist given by a state-licensed physician every 48 months. Pilots must also complete an online medical education course every 24 calendar months and maintain records of their compliance with the requirements. And finally, here's an uplifting story that comes from 11alive.com. Pilot retiring after 35 years gives wings to boy who has Down syndrome. It was the captain's last flight and the boy's first. An American Airlines pilot retiring after 35 years gave his wings to a Florida toddler with Down syndrome after his final flight. Sarah and Kai Klittennick had been sitting next to the pilot's wife on a flight from Madrid to Miami earlier this month. The woman texted her husband in the cockpit asking Captain Joe Weiss to come and meet 2-year-old Kai. Weiss took the child on a tour of the cockpit and then pinned his wing on Kai's shirt. The token was not the commemorative ones for kids and were the captain's personal wings from the airline. The Orlando Sentinel reported Friday that the delighted toddler clapped and said thank you in sign language. Sarah Klittennick said her son can't stop talking about his new friend. American Airlines issued a statement saying, all of us at American are truly touched by the actions of Captain Joseph Weiss. Captain Weiss, who started with American in March 1985, always loved to engage with his passengers. When Captain Weiss found out his last flight at American was Kai's first flight, he wanted to pass along his wings to a future generation. We're all proud of Captain Weiss and wish him all the best in his retirement. We also look forward to welcoming Kai on future American Airlines flights along with his wings. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, my weekly updates. And then we'll get to our main topic of deadly propeller accidents. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now let me give you a few quick updates. First, I've hardly done any flying at all in the past week as I've had a nasty head cold that's kept me on the ground for 7 days. Now, I have been back in the air for 2 flights over the past 2 days, but I limited those flights to 1,500 feet to minimize the chances of getting one of my ears blocked, and I'll gradually start doing higher altitudes over the next few days. And I mentioned last week that I'm going to have a listener meetup coming up very soon in Olathe, Kansas. I finally nailed down those details. It's going to be Wednesday, October 30th at 5:30 p.m. It's at a location just off Interstate 35, so it should be relatively easy for people to get to. It's going to be at a Starbucks, and that's at 16521 West 119th Street, Olathe, Kansas. So look forward to seeing you there on Wednesday, October 30th, 5:30 p.m. And I want to thank Jason Mormile, one of our Patreon supporters, for sending us this fun flying destination. Here it is.
Hey Max, Jason Mormile here. Wanted to throw my 2 cents in on a great little GA airport to fly. We are in upstate New York, and one of our favorite destinations is Lake Placid, and the airport identifier is Kilo Lima, Kilo Papa. And great little airport. It does have instrument approaches, so if weather is not perfect, picture perfect. You can still get in and out. And if you fly in and go to the FBO, they will radio the trolley. So Lake Placid runs a free trolley around town, and they will radio it. It will stop right at the airport, pick you up, and take you right into town. Lake Placid has the Olympic Village. They hosted the Olympics back in 1980, and great little place to go. Plenty of restaurants. There's some great Adirondack hikes that start right from the village. Just a great little time, great little airport. So that's my recommendation for upstate New York Adirondack flying. Have a good day.
Thanks so much, Jason. And that is the last fun flying destination that we have in our queue. So if you have one you'd like to either write up or record, please send it to me. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on contact at the top of the page to email me your fun flying destination, or click on listener question and you can record it just as Jason did if you keep it within 90 seconds. Now, let's see, back in September, I taught an all-day mini CPPP or Cirrus Pilot Proficiency Program along with Elliot Flourish, who, like me, is also a Platinum CSIP instructor. And it turned out that probably the most popular session there was not either of our presentations, but it was an hour-and-a-half discussion with two controllers from Oakland Center and one from Palo Alto Tower presenting. In fact, we let that session run well into the lunch hour, almost total of 2 hours, just because attendees had so many questions. And I made a couple of notes that I wanted to share with you. One which came from an Oakland Center controller was that sometimes center controllers and also approach controllers are talking on two frequencies simultaneously. And they'll do that especially at night when there's less traffic and they combine multiple sectors together so that a controller is managing a much larger geographical area. And when they do that, they're often talking on multiple frequencies simultaneously because, of course, one ground transmitter won't have the coverage needed to cover the entire area the controller is managing. So in that situation, you'll hear the controller talking, but some of the time you won't hear aircraft responding back to him because those aircraft are talking with a controller on a different frequency from the one that you're on. So you'll hear the controller all the time, but you won't always hear pilots responding if multiple frequencies are in use. And the controller's point was that in these kinds of situations, when you hear a controller give an instruction, but you don't hear another aircraft replying, don't immediately start transmitting to call the controller. Instead, wait for about the amount of time you think it would take for the aircraft that you can't hear to respond, and after that time has elapsed, then start a new transmission to the controller. So always leave some time for a pilot to read back the instruction, even if you can't hear the other pilot giving that read back to the controller. Now, I also asked one of the controllers about how important is it to give altitudes in the standard FAA format, which, if you're not familiar with it, it's this. You say thousands of feet first and then hundreds of feet. So, for example, when you're checking in, you might say that you're level at 4,500. By contrast, you're not supposed to say that you're at 4,500 feet or that you're at 4.5. Now, things get a little more complicated when you're at 10,000 feet. The controller handbook says you should pronounce each digit in the number of hundreds or thousands, followed by the word hundred or thousand as appropriate. And they give these examples. For 10,000 feet, you should say 10,000, or for 11,000 feet, say 11,000. But then the handbook goes on to say altitudes may be restated in group form for added clarity if the controller chooses. And the examples they give are, you could say 10,000, 10,000 feet. Now, when I asked the controller about saying 4,500 feet or 4.5 instead of saying the correct 4,500, he said that he strongly prefers that you say 4,500 feet, and that if you say something different, such as 4,500 or 4.5, technically he's supposed to correct you, but he said he just never has the time to do that. Now, we also talked with the controllers about emergencies, and of course, you know that in an emergency, a controller is going to ask you how many hours of fuel you have on board and how many souls are on board. Now, personally, I have always hated that expression, souls on board, because to me it sounds like we're almost expecting the people on board to die. In fact, I just looked up the definition a few minutes ago on soul, and one definition is the spiritual or immaterial part of a human being or animal regarded as immortal. Yikes. So even if you die in a crash, your soul survives and might still be on board the aircraft. So I've always thought, why add more stress to an emergency by suggesting that the end may be near by using the word souls when you could just as easily ask how many people are on board? And I was delighted to hear that apparently there's been a recent change. The Oakland Center controller said they're now trained in an emergency to ask how many people are on board, which I think is a great improvement. Now, I want to give a shout out to EAA Chapter 1292 for a good deal. It's an article that appeared in the Sun Gazette, which is a newspaper down in California's Central Valley north of Bakersfield. Title is Pilots Land 1,000 Pounds of Food at Pantry's Doorstep. And briefly, it says that over 1,000 pounds of food landed on the doorstep of the Woodlake Food Pantry earlier this month, thanks to a group of local pilots giving kids a bird's eye view of their hometown. The Woodlake Chapter 1292 of the EAA, known as the Woodlake Flying Tigers, raised the food donation during its Food for Flights event on October 5th at Woodlake Airport. Each person over the age of 8 who donated a bag of non-perishable food was offered a free flight in one of the private planes taking off and landing at the airport. More than 100 people generously contributed to the cause, resulting in 92 participants going up for a flight and 1,010 pounds of food being delivered to the Woodlake Food Pantry. Quote, the members of this chapter have discussed different ways to give back to the community while sharing their love of aviation, stated Michelle Cruz, a volunteer for the chapter. As the end of the year approaches, the members felt this was a great way to start off the holiday season. And I agree. So great job, Chapter 1292. And I think if you're a member of an EAA chapter elsewhere around the country, you might want to consider doing something like this at your chapter as well. Now, here's a story I received from Dan Friedman. He's one of our Patreon supporters, and I thought you'd enjoy this. Dan wrote, on Saturday, my instructor said I should be able to solo soon, maybe even during that day's lesson. So, of course, I was scared to death and almost threw up. Well, yeah, I guess you were scared. We ended up being grounded for 2.5 hours because of the weather, but finally at 12:30 p.m., we made it out with 30 minutes available to fly. I had controls the entire time, but that's not new. During the pattern work at upwind, base, and final, I had the flaps configured properly, 10 degrees, then 20 degrees, then 30 degrees. The speed was spot on, 80 knots, 70 knots, 65 knots. My banking turns were 30 degrees, no more. Everything was perfect, perfect, perfect. That's in all capital letters. I looked over at Dave, my CFI, all impressed with myself. Even my communication with ATC sounded good. 937 Sierra Alpha, midfield, full stop landing, and taxi back. Now, Frederick is a small airport, and I think the ATC lady even knew what my last communication meant. Strangely, though, as I looked over at Dave, I couldn't help but notice he had an incredulous look on his face, staring at me with a look of, what the heck are you doing? I wasn't sure what that was all about, so I just got back to what I was supposed to do, fly the plane. So as I said, all was awesome, but for one detail, one tiny, minute detail, I forgot to descend. I was at 1,300 feet MSL the entire time. Even the ATC tower lady broadcast to everyone, 937 Sierra Alpha is a little too high. I had to broadcast a reply for the world to hear. 937 Sierra Alpha will be doing a missed approach go around. My guess is that this was the farthest missed approach landing anyone has ever seen. I used to tell my friends that the worst landing Dave ever experienced was my first attempt to land. Now I have a new story to tell. Needless to say, after going around the pattern twice and run up and taxi back, we ran out of time. He'll tell me tomorrow morning that tomorrow will be my first solo day, and maybe it will be, maybe it won't be. For the record, Dave has been my CFI therapist since January. I love that phrase, by the way. And him telling me I'll be soloing soon is because he knows how my mind works. He'd rather me be super nervous now so that when I do finally solo, I'll have heard him say more than once, today may be the day. Well, thanks for letting me share my story. I listen to you every week, and you have been with me since the very beginning. Great story, Dave. I particularly like the phrase you used, CFI therapist. I don't know that I've actually heard it used that way before, but I have many times said that flying is cheaper than therapy and it's less expensive. Now, I'm just kind of kidding. I don't mean to diss therapy. But yeah, I think sometimes the role of a CFI is part therapist. So thanks so much for sharing that story. Now, Dan is, of course, a Patreon supporter, and I recently made a change to one of our Patreon support levels, so let me tell you about that. As you probably know, $4 a month supporters get copies of my original show notes for every news show, like the one I'm reading from right now. And $8 a month supporters get the show notes plus links to all of the news stories that didn't make it into the news. And this week there were 15 stories, all related to general aviation, that we didn't have time to cover. But our $8 a month and higher supporters get to see those stories. Now, I've just made a change to our first officer tier, which is the $20 a month level, and I call those our super supporters. And recently I started releasing some of the new episodes a day early before everyone else gets the new show. And you can get that early access to these new shows at the $20 a month level. The next tier is our left seat tier, which is for $50 a month supporters. And of course, I call them our mega supporters. In addition to everything else, after 2 months, they get a signed copy of one of my books, and I need to get a couple of those shipped out. So I'm going to be working on that this coming week. Plus, I read the name of mega supporters on every news shows. The next tier is our instructor pilot tier at $100 a month. And currently, we have one supporter in that tier. After 2 months at that level, you get a signed copy of both of my books. And the top tier is the Mentee tier at $200 a month. And at that level, you get to pick my brain with 2 30-minute phone calls each month. And I limited the number of people who can sign up for that tier. And I'm happy to announce that this week we had someone sign up for the Mentee tier. So I want to thank very much Brian Deere. Brian lives here in Northern California. He recently acquired a turbocharged 206, which he is having a lot of fun flying. And he and I will be spending some time on the phone later this month. And we have some new super supporters, those who donate $20 a month or more each month. And I want to thank Arno Weber, a new super supporter. He flies a TBM 900. He uses that for work and to go places with family, but he also flies an extra 330 on weekends for aerobatics. So thanks very much, Arno. We've got some other new Patreon supporters. They include Adjton Hedzik and Rob. And we have a one-time donation via PayPal, which came to us from Art Hernandez, a $100 donation. Thank you so much, Art. Now, as I mentioned, our mega supporters that donate $50 a month or more, they include Brian Deere, who I just mentioned, Tyson Weiss, co-founder of 4Flight, Victor Vogel, who lives in central PA and flies a Cirrus, Tim Delaney, who's been flying for 50 years and flies an SR20 in Northern California, Stephen Elop flies a turbocharged 182 and a Citation M2 and was recently named CEO of API Jet, Larry Noe from New York City, he flies a Cirrus SR22, and also Mike Williams, he's the president of Keomac and also TCB Composites, which make composite spinners and bulkheads for GA aircraft. He flies a 172. Seth Lake, he's a new DPE giving check rides, specializes in the multi-engine rating and beach travel air, and you can find out about his flight school at vsl.aero. And finally, Rick Miller, who teaches part-time as a flight instructor at the Lunken Flight Training Center and also with private clients who fly in various Pipers, Cessnas, Beechcrafts, and Cicadas. So I'd like to thank them and all of our Patreon supporters who support the show. Now in a moment, we're going to be talking about deadly propeller accidents right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now let's talk about propeller accidents. Now you may be thinking, hey, those don't happen very often and they're pretty simple to avoid. Just stay away from the propeller when the engine is running. And yes, I used to think that they were very infrequent, but then I realized I could think of 3 fatal propeller accidents just here in Northern California, and those were just the ones that came to mind immediately that I didn't have to look up. And when I started to research the topic, I was actually surprised at the number of accidents that I found. Interestingly, some of them don't even show up in the NTSB database, but I was able to find them by searching in Google News, which makes me think they're probably underreported and hence more common than we might think. Now, the reason I was prompted to talk about this was an item in the news about a week ago. Here's what it said in USA Today. Florida woman's right hand severed by private plane's propeller in Key West accident. Florida woman lost her right hand and 2 toes on her right foot when a propeller blade hit her Saturday. She was helping to prepare a private plane for takeoff at Key West International. A report from the Miami office of the Florida Highway Patrol listed Rebecca Gray, 45, as a passenger in a 1966 Cessna 172, being piloted by her husband, Walter Gray, 46. The couple rented the plane in Fort Myers, where they reside. The FAA is conducting an investigation. Her father-in-law, V.W. Gray Sr., told the Fort Myers News Press. Now, my daughter-in-law, Rebecca, will recover, he said. Obviously, it could have been much worse, for which we're very thankful. Approximately 9:30 p.m., Gray was outside of the aircraft removing the chock blocks that were keeping the plane's wheels in place in preparation for takeoff, the FHP report said. The engine was on and the single front-mounted propeller was spinning. As she removed the chocks from the plane's front wheel, the right side of the spinning propeller struck the right side of her body. Gray was initially taken to Lower Keys Medical Center and later flown to Ryder Trauma in Miami. Now here's some additional details I found in the Miami Herald. Now that's a paper I've been reading more and more often, as I did give flight instruction to their CEO about a year ago. They say the incident began when Walter Gray tried to taxi on the runway, but the plane wouldn't move. He got out while the plane was still running to check to see if the plane's tires were still in the wheel chocks, the wedges of sturdy material put against the plane's wheels to prevent accidental movement. He told his wife to stay in the plane, but she got out. Gray then told his wife not to go to the front of the plane, but she did. She went to remove a chock from the plane's tires, and she came in contact with the propeller. Now let's examine some of the links in the accident chain. First, it was around 9 p.m. in October, so we know for certain that it was totally dark outside. And as I mentioned last week in episode 124, when it's dark, accidents are twice as likely to be fatal. Now, fortunately, this accident wasn't fatal, but remember that even in the daytime, it's a little difficult to see a spinning propeller, but at night, it's almost impossible to see a spinning propeller. So it's not a surprise at all that this poor woman didn't see the propeller. But I think the accident chain started much earlier. Obviously, the pilot missed seeing the chocks during his pre-flight, in part because it was totally dark outside. And it's entirely possible that he was at an FBO and that the FBO chocked the airplane. And possibly the pilot didn't routinely use chocks. The first article says it was a rented plane, and none of the rental planes I fly are chocked as they're all tied down. So the pilot might not be used to using chocks, and the chocks might have been put there under the tires by the FBO after the pilot left his plane, so he might not have even been aware they were there. So the first link in the accident chain was failing to remove the chocks during the pre-flight. The next link in the accident chain was failing to turn off the engine before getting out of the plane to remove the chocks. Now, there are a number of reasons a pilot might leave the engine on when exiting an airplane, and I think they're all bad. Yes, if you had trouble starting the plane, you might be reluctant to turn off the engine if you're concerned that you won't be able to get started again. And as you can see, on balance, it's far better to not be able to get the plane restarted and to be stuck there overnight than to be injured or possibly killed by a spinning propeller. So I'd like to suggest that you create a rule for yourself, which is that you never, ever let anyone, including yourself, exit an airplane with the engine running. No matter how careful you think you will be or how careful you'll think your passengers will be, people are human, which means in part that we all make mistakes. So no matter how careful you are, you might make a mistake, and the consequences of a mistake with a propeller are always high. Now, a key problem is I think it's easy to dismiss what we consider low probability but high consequence events. So if you think the possibility of getting struck by a propeller is extremely remote and that it will never happen to you or a passenger, then it's easy to get complacent and think, okay, just this one time I'm going to let a passenger out of the plane with the engine turning. But it doesn't matter if the probability of the event is low. Remember this, some people actually win the lottery, even when the odds are over 1,000,000 to 1. And frankly, based on the stories I read, I think the chances of getting hit by a moving propeller are actually better than those odds. And the consequences, yep, they're just unthinkable. There's an excellent chance you'll be dismembered or die. So let me ask you this, are you willing to risk death or dismemberment even if the odds were 1,000,000 to 1, which they're not? I think they're worse than that. Even when you have a perfectly good alternative, which is to shut off the engine first? I mean, it seems so obvious, but it's worth thinking through ahead of time because we all sometimes do something we shouldn't, and we rationalize our actions for all kinds of reasons. For example, we may feel that we're saving time because what if we can't get the engine started again? To which I would say, boy, that's a small inconvenience compared to having to go to the emergency room or worse to a funeral because you decided it would be okay this one time to let someone out of the plane while the engine is still running. Here's what Hartzell Propeller has to say about the subject on their website. It's important to remember that the propeller is an extension of the engine. Pilots and passengers should always exercise caution when in the vicinity of the propeller, even if the engine is off. AOPA advises pilots to assume the ignition has been left in the on position and that the engine could start at any moment. Pilots should periodically check that the aircraft engine's dual magneto systems have properly shut down the engine to avoid the risk of an unexpected start or backfire. Never attempt to load or unload an airplane with the engine running. The aircraft's engine should always be shut down for loading or discharging passengers or cargo. Even if you give careful instructions to passengers or crew, the engine noise can make it hard for them to understand your directions. If you do need assistance, first shut down the engine and then brief your assistants on their task. Now let's go back to that article in the Miami Herald. Gray told his wife to stay in the plane, but she got out. He then told his wife not to go to the front of the plane, but she did. Now think about this. She might not have been able to hear him say, don't go to the front of the plane because of the noise of the engine. Also, it sounds like there was nobody left in the plane, but they were planning to pull the chocks, which means the plane could have started moving with nobody inside, which would have been bad. Back to Hartzell Propeller, they say, make sure your passengers understand areas to avoid. As a pilot, it's your responsibility to make sure your passengers understand the dangers of a moving propeller. Spinning propeller blades are difficult to see in the daytime and nearly invisible at night. At Hartzell Propeller, we encourage pilots to choose a propeller paint scheme with blade tip markings in contrasting colors to enhance the visibility of the spinning prop. Before any flight, pilots should explain to passengers which area of the aircraft should be avoided, especially when approaching or exiting the cabin. Be aware of your passengers' movements and kill the engine immediately if someone begins to walk in the direction of a spinning prop. Propeller strike accidents may be infrequent, but they are dangerous. Take caution to prepare your guests and passengers before every flight to avoid propeller-related incidents. Okay, good advice. Now let's talk about some of the other prop-related accidents that have happened in the past year or so. From the New York Daily News, this occurred just a few months ago in June. Ohio skydiving employee dies after walking into aircraft propeller. An employee at a Southwest Ohio skydiving business has died from head injuries she suffered when she walked into a spinning airplane propeller. Sarah Rhodes, 24, died at a Dayton hospital where she was flown after the accident in Middletown. The Miamisburg resident had been office manager for 3 years at Start Skydiving, which operates near Middletown Regional Airport. Owner John Hart said it's the first time the business has had such an accident. He said it can be difficult to see fast-spinning propeller blades. It doesn't get any worse than this. She was like a daughter. I love that girl. Coworkers said Rhodes had walked down onto the tarmac planning to ask a pilot if he wanted food, but she inadvertently walked in the propeller of another plane that was idling on the tarmac. The FAA will investigate. Hart said an annual Labor Day event at the airport called Work Stinks Boogie will be renamed the Sarah Boogie this year. We will never forget Sarah, Hart said. We want to celebrate her life. And in my research, I found a number of propeller accidents that happened to employees or to people in the military. Just 2 years ago on CBSLocal.com, they reported that United Airlines employees struck by plane propeller at Newark Airport. The story says authorities say a worker was struck and seriously injured by a moving propeller at Newark Liberty International Airport. Port Authority of New York and New Jersey Police Department spokesman Joseph Pentangelo says the accident occurred around 2:20 a.m. Saturday in a maintenance area of the airport across from Terminal A, but further details were not immediately available. The injured woman, a 54-year-old Orange resident who works for United Airlines, was taken to University Hospital with serious head injury. Authorities say the plane was not on a runway at the time of the accident, which remains under investigation. And here's a story that comes from January this year. It appears in pbcommercial.com. It says, a 41-year-old woman suffered severe injuries after being struck by a spinning airplane propeller at the Houma Terrebonne Airport. Now that's in Louisiana. According to Houma Police Sergeant Travis Therout, the accident occurred about 11:45 p.m. Now note, this also happened at night when props are hard to see. The story says the unidentified victim stood too close to a parked airplane while its engine was running. The propeller struck her arm, Therout said. She was transferred to a medical facility in New Orleans with severe trauma injuries. The plane was stopped in place, but the engine was still running. John Wheeler, Houma Terrebonne Airport Executive Director, said the airplane did not belong to the victim. Quote, a gentleman who went out to check on his airplane that hadn't been run in a while, he said. A lady who was with him got out of the truck and inadvertently walked into the prop. From my understanding, she's in stable condition. Although such accidents are not common, spinning airplane propellers can be difficult to see in the dark, Wheeler said. The accident will help tighten safety precautions at the airport to prevent future incidents. Quote, speaking with other tenants here, we've all grown up around airplanes and have been with them for a long time, Wheeler said. We sometimes take them for granted. My tenants are tightening up on how they operate. Once this type of incident happens, it creates a lot more respect for the airplane. It's kind of like when you drive a car and haven't had a blown tire for 3 or 4 years. You start to get complacent and take it for granted. It will be my job to mitigate this risk. And just 2 weeks ago, on Inside Edition, which is a TV show that comes on usually around 7 o'clock on local television, they had a video that you can find on their website about a woman who had a propeller accident last year. Now, I put a link to that article in the video in the show notes, and it's titled, What Life's Like for a Woman Who Lost Arm and Hand After Walking into Plane Propeller. Here's the story. One woman is adjusting to a new life after losing her right arm and left hand in a freak accident with a plane propeller. I didn't think I was going to live, Shauna Bona told Inside Edition of the incident. Tragedy struck last January when Bono's boyfriend Clark was checking on a plane with a friend. He's a pilot and the two were in the cockpit when Bono approached the aircraft. I thought it would make a good picture, she said, to which, by the way, I should mention, when I was at the Grand Canyon earlier this month, I saw a number of things I would never do, all in the name of trying to get a good picture. Now, all these people had climbed over railings to get dangerously close to the edge of the Grand Canyon. So please, when you're looking for that great photo, please be careful, and that's what happened here. The story says, Bono walked toward the plane holding her cell phone in front of her. She said it was dark and the wind muffled the sounds of the idling engine. I never saw or heard the propeller at all, she said. Suddenly she walked right into propeller blade. It took her arm and hand. Clark raced to her side and his friend called 911. I just thought, how can I live this way? How am I going to go on? How am I going to survive, she said. She had not only survived, but she has moved on with her life and is not letting her loss stop her from living. She's one of the toughest women I've met, Clark told Inside Edition. She puts on her own makeup, vacuums, and uses a homemade prosthetic device fashioned from a soda bottle to blow dry her hair. Another homemade device helps her eat on her own. Inside Edition was with her as she met with prosthetic specialist Brian Moore, who measured her for some new limbs. He told her she'll be able to swim and ride a bike. We'll be able to adapt your prosthesis for whatever you want, he said. She now has her sights set on training for a triathlon as she gets fitted for her prosthetics. Really brave lady. Now, let me mention the 3 incidents I recall that have happened here in Northern California. Years ago, a Cessna 210 flew a charter flight to Fresno, and the pilot waited at the airport while 2 people went off to do some business. It was after dark when one of the men phoned the pilot to tell him they would be there in 5 minutes and to go ahead and get the engine started. The pilot started the 210, and he was sitting in the cockpit looking down, and when he looked up, he saw that passenger walk directly into the propeller, killing him. Note again, this happened at night. And at the Hayward Airport, there was an accident with 2 pilots who coincidentally were also flying a Cessna 210. Now, this was the turbocharged version, the T210, and I was a partner of one of those about 20 years ago. Part of the shutdown checklist is that you need to wait 5 minutes before turning off the engine. And that was a common requirement for many older turbocharged aircraft. And the reason was that if you shut down the aircraft immediately after landing, the turbocharger, which spins at about 80,000 RPM, would continue to spin long after the engine was shut down. But shutting down the engine would stop the oil flow to the turbocharger. So the oil that remained trapped in the turbocharger would get hotter and hotter and eventually coke some of the oil onto the bearings, destroying the bearings. So the procedure is you have to leave the engine idling so that the turbocharger has time to spin down while it's still getting oil flow from the engine, which is still on. My solution, by the way, was just to taxi very slowly to my parking spot. And if I did that, I could immediately shut down the engine when I reached my parking spot. Now here's what the NTSB report says. Quote, after landing, the pilot taxied to the pad area where he turned the airplane around, positioning the nose to face the runways. The pilot began cooling down the turbocharged engine by maintaining low RPM while keeping the airplane stationary. He planned to perform an approximate 5-minute cooling down period and then taxi the airplane to a parking area where he would shut down. After several minutes of the airplane standing, the passenger took off his headset, got out of the airplane, and walked into the rotating propeller. The pilot was not sure of the reasoning behind the passenger exiting the airplane, but thought he may have been getting impatient with the wait for the engine cool down. The pilot stated that the passenger was an experienced pilot. In recent years, he mostly flew airplanes that were equipped with wing struts. Of course, there are no struts on the Cessna 210. My recollection from that accident was that the pilot was in his late 50s, and the passenger who was struck by the prop was in his 70s, as I recall. Now, here's part of the NTSB report of an accident that occurred at Christmas time a number of years ago at the Nut Tree Airport, which is northeast of San Francisco. On December 26, 2003, about 9 a.m. Pacific, the propeller of a Cessna 172 contacted the pilot while he was hand-propping the airplane at Nut Tree Airport in Vacaville, California. The private pilot sustained fatal injuries. The plane was not damaged. The flight was destined for Lincoln Airport in Lincoln, California, and was originating at the time. VMC conditions prevailed and no flight plan had been filed. The pilot succumbed to his injuries on January 2, 2004. The responding Solano County Sheriff's Office deputy reported that family members discovered the injured pilot on December 27th. By the way, that would be the following day, which meant that that pilot was alone by himself, injured for probably 24 hours at the airport. The pilot sustained head injuries and was seated in the passenger seat of his vehicle that was parked at the airport. The airplane was tied down and the left main wheel was shocked. The left door was open and the mag switch was in the both position. The pilot's right shoe was on the right side of the airplane, forward of the propeller. A trail of blood led from the front of the airplane to the passenger side of the pilot's vehicle. The pilot was initially hospitalized with serious head injuries and subsequently died on January 2, 2004. And the report says that the FAA publication called Preventing Accidents During Aircraft Ground Operations prevents suggestions to aid in increasing the safety factor while hand-starting airplanes. The publication states the following: no one should attempt to start an aircraft engine without a qualified person at the cockpit controls. The person turning the propeller should be properly trained in the technique of hand cranking. If you have in mind to try hand propping by yourself, don't. If you must hand prop, get qualified help to position the engine controls and switches during the starting procedure. If hand propping can be avoided, do. Unsupervised hand propping of an airplane should not be attempted by inexperienced persons. Regardless of the experience level, it should never be attempted by anyone without adhering to adequate safety measures. Uninformed or inexperienced persons or non-pilot passengers should never handle the throttle, brakes, or switches during starting procedures. The airplane should be securely chocked or tied down, and great care should be exercised in setting the throttle. It may be well to turn the fuel selector valve to the off position after properly priming the engine and prior to attempting a hand start. After it starts, the engine will usually run long enough with the fuel off to prevent walking around the propeller and turning the fuel selector to the on position. Now, I want to wrap things up today by referring you to episode 13 of the Aviation News Talk podcast, which was called Hot Prop Dangers, How Magnetos Work, and Best Way to Do a Mag Check. In it, we talked about magnetos, which are the culprits that can lead to a hot prop. We discussed the mag check that pilots do during their run-up before takeoff, and how to use it to make sure you don't have a hot prop. Now, I talked about this because I've run into many experienced pilots who are not aware of how to determine whether they have a hot prop or of the safe way to turn a propeller by hand. Now, you can easily get to episode 13 by going out to the internet, typing in aviationnewstalk.com/13, and I'll have a link to that in our show notes. So in summary, please don't become complacent around propellers, and make sure that you and people around you don't come in contact with a propeller. One way to do that is to never let anyone exit the airplane without first shutting down the engine. So, hey, let's be careful out there. Coming up next, listener feedback, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Okay, let's go to a sampling of some listener email. Here's one from Alex in New Zealand. He says, today I listened to episode 40 and the story of the Cessna pilot who was flying low and hit power lines. I was most saddened to hear the tragic story of your friend and his granddaughter. This talk of low flying got me thinking about something that has come up in my training. I've been working on my PPL in New Zealand, where low flying is an actual training requirement, minimum 2 hours. The logic is that the weather in New Zealand can change very quickly, and although such a scenario should always be avoided with careful planning, if you do end up stuck under weather that moves in, you can fly very low to stay under it until you find a safe place to land. To practice this, what you do is go out to a specific low flying zone, marked on the VFR charts, where the normal restrictions are lifted, usually around a river with fields and a few farmhouses around. You can go as low as 200 feet AGL, mostly flying in what Kiwis call a bad weather configuration. In a 172, that's 75 knots indicated with 20 degrees of flaps. Although I don't think there's anything to say you can't do it at 100 knots clean, you even practice steep turns at 200 feet. I would be super interested to hear your take on this from a safety perspective. There are, of course, some advantages. Getting really comfortable maneuvering the plane close to the ground is good for landing in confidence, and the skill may one day be useful if you really do inadvertently get stuck under the weather. And naturally, having dedicated low-flying zones does make this a lot safer. But there is a disadvantage. It's teaching pilots how much fun it is to fly very, very low, as your late friend said, chasing cows. And having done some training in the U.S., I find it a bit hard to imagine that flying schools or instructors would be comfortable with such an exercise for private students, much less encourage it. Well, Alex, I think you've already highlighted the key trade-offs there. I'm not sure there's a lot that I can add. It's definitely interesting, and you're right, that's not something we have here in the U.S. Pilots are generally not encouraged or taught how to fly close to the ground. And here's an email from a gentleman who asked to remain anonymous. Don't get many of those. He's from Southern California. He says, couldn't help but relay this terrifying story about stopping another pilot from doing something stupid. I had to tell a bold-faced lie to get him to stop from killing 3 people. One of them, me. Well, good job. I was going to say, whatever it takes to stop somebody, that's great. He says the flight was with a non-instrument rated pilot from WHCP, that's the Whiteman Airport, which is kind of at the northern end of the LA basin, to CMA, that would be Camarillo, which is out by the coast in Southern California. I was in the back seat of a PA-32C6, having just returned to flying after a 40-year hiatus. Shortly after takeoff, we noticed the classic marine layer, which would be a low layer of clouds off the ocean, not far from Whiteman. I'm thinking he was going to turn around, talking about the pilot in front of him. But no, he decides to scud run. Before long, we are in thick soup with occasional glimpses of close-by terrain. Suddenly, I notice we are below the terrain beside us. Getting desperate, I tell him to climb, but I'm feeling like a backseat driver and an inexperienced one at that. Does he climb or turn back? No. So I'm thinking, how do I get us out of this alive? So I decided to lie. I pull out my 4th light and I tell him I'm checking the weather at Camarillo. I tell him, hey, the METAR says Airport closed until further notice due to ground fog. I didn't even know if I was using proper terminology, but it worked. He climbed right out and went home. Only as I've rebuilt my flying skills in my SR-22 have I realized how dangerous that flight really was. Sometimes when the potential outcome is horrendous and possible, a little white lie may be in order. Thanks for the best podcast in the industry. I wouldn't miss a single one. Well, good job. I think that makes total sense what you did there. And I heard from several different pilots about this topic. Let me go ahead and read this one from Chun. He's in Virginia. He says, "Hi, Max. I was listening to your last podcast, so that would have been episode 124. One of your listeners mentioned about an ASOS that was activated on 3 clicks on CTAF. We have one of these at my home field at VKX Potomac Airfield. The one installed here is called a micro tower made by Potomac Aviation. Check out the AvWeb feature article on that. I did find that. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. He says, search for AvWeb micro tower on YouTube. They are super handy. Do you know that they can conduct a comm check with it too? And yes, I did go through the video and it demonstrated the comm check. Essentially, someone can key up their microphone and say, testing 1, 2, 3, and this micro tower will then play back to them, testing 1, 2, 3. And I think it also indicates how strong your signal is, which I think is really clever because you're effectively testing the entire radio all the way from your headset microphone through the radio all the way up to the antenna. So there's probably no better check than something like that. Now here's some feedback from Daniel Switkin, local pilot here in Northern California.
Hi, Max. This is Daniel Switkin. I had a couple thoughts for you. The first was I actually got a ride on that specific B-17 and with that pilot a couple of years ago when they came through Moffett. It was a terrific experience, and it's incredibly sad to hear the news about it. And I just wanted to encourage everyone to keep taking those flights. I certainly hope the Collins Foundation resumes their program. They are absolutely unique and worthwhile experiences. The second was about a listener who had proposed eliminating recording VOR checks. And I wanted to offer an opposing opinion on that. As a renter, I don't know when the last VOR check was done. And so it's very important that I have a written record of that. As an owner, I can understand maybe that feels like more of a hassle. But I also wanted to point out that the regs only say that you make a notation in the aircraft log or other record, which means you can write it anywhere. Frankly, it seems like you could just take a note in ForeFlight. So for something that takes 10 or 15 seconds and is a good reminder of whether you've done it or not, I really don't think it's a major hassle. And especially as a renter, I'd like to make sure that we continue that practice. All right, thanks.
Thanks very much, Daniel. And now let's go to listener questions.
My name is Jake. I'm 28 years old and I live in Australia. I'm looking to do my commercial pilot license for aeroplane. And I have 2 options. I guess like most people, I have option 1, pay for it all up front, do it in 1 year, get it all done full time. Or option 2, continue to work my full-time job now and do the CPL part-time, doing the theory and flying in the evenings and on the weekends, which will take me approximately, I would say, between 2 and 2.5 years. And I just don't know which is better to go for. I haven't really spoken to anyone that's done the part-time route, because when I go to the flying college, pretty much everyone there seems to have done the full-time from what I can tell. Just half of me thinks, the full-time would be good because I can get it all done. But then I'm also thinking I have to wait another approximately 2 years to save up for it. Whereas if I do the part-time route, I could start in Easter 2020, which would keep me, I think, a lot more motivated. Anyway, if you have any advice, that would be great.
Jake, I'm going to assume that when you say you want to get your commercial pilot license, that you currently don't have a license and you're going to be starting from close to 0 flying time, and that your goal is to get a job as a pilot, and I'm guessing that ultimately you want to be an airline pilot. I did some quick research on flying colleges in Australia. It looks like they are geared for people looking for an airline career, and for around maybe $60,000 Australian and a little over a year, you can get your commercial pilot certificate, which would allow you to get some pilot jobs for hire. Now, you could also spend closer to 80 or 90,000 Australian and get several other important ratings, including your IFR rating and multi-engine rating, which would open up even more jobs as well. Now, you certainly highlighted some of the trade-offs. It sounds like from what you said that you can't afford to quit your job now and go full-time because you'll need to spend 2 years saving the money that you'll need. So it sounds like you have a decent job that you like and that pays you reasonably well, and that you would use your job to fund most of the cost of flight training, which you could more easily afford if you spread the training out over several years and did your training in the evenings on weekends. Now, interestingly, as I compare the two options you've outlined, it sounds like you'll be finished at about the same time. If you were to go full-time, you'll first work for 2 years and then go full-time for a year, so you're done in 3 years. And if you go part-time starting now, you said you'd be done in 2 to 2.5 years. So by your calculations, you might be done 6 months, maybe a year sooner if you go part-time. And I'd like to suggest that there's a third option, which is that you could quit your job now, take out a loan, and you could start studying full-time now, in which case you'd be done a year from now, though of course you'd have a large student loan. And here's how I would look at it. If you don't like your job, the one that you're in currently, then definitely quit, go full-time now. And I say that because it's just not worth spending your time at a job for years that you don't like. There was certainly a period of time near the end of my high-tech career when I wasn't happy in the job, and I can tell you it's no fun telling yourself at least once a day the words, "I hate my job." Now, here's another consideration, and you really should factor this into your thinking. The market for airline pilots is extremely hot right now, and the sooner you get into that market, the better, because this hot hiring market, it's not going to last forever. All it would take is a solid recession for the hiring to slow down dramatically or maybe stop altogether, and we saw that happen back in 2001 and to a much lesser extent 2008. So the sooner you get hired, the better. Also, airline pilots tell me that seniority is everything. So the sooner you get hired, the sooner you'll be able to pick better routes that allow you to get your monthly flying done with fewer longer flights, which means you won't be working quite as hard, and you'll certainly end up with more days off every month. So my advice would be that if there's a way for you to afford to go full-time now, that all things being equal, that would be a great way to go. And if not, I'd lean toward whichever option will get you through flying college sooner so that you can start working as a pilot sooner. Jake, good luck to you, and let us know what you decide. And here's an email from one of our Patreon supporters, Alex. Alex says, within the last year, I received my private pilot certificate. I have no intentions to become a commercial pilot and fly mostly with friends and family within roughly 100 miles of my home field. I'm relatively young, 34, and want to continue my training, with the next step being my instrument rating. I've read articles and heard others talk about this transition, but would appreciate hearing your take on it. What does the process entail, and how should I be spending my time flying now? If you've discussed this on previous podcasts, my apologies. Thanks, Alex. Well, Alex, first, thanks for listening to the show and for being a Patreon supporter. And an IFR rating, yes, that's definitely a logical next step. I would make sure that on your current flights, that whenever you fly, you stop at airports at least more than 50 nautical miles away from home. So that way you can start logging the 50 hours of cross-country time that you're going to need prior to taking the instrument check ride. Now, you don't need to get the full 50 hours before you start instrument training, but I'd suggest that you have at least 30 hours and then let your CFI know that you'll need to make some of the IFR training flights also cross-country flights so that you can log the additional time that you'll need, which should be relatively easy to do. If you were trying to make all 40 hours of your instrument training cross-country, that gets a little difficult logistically. Now, the process is easier than getting a private. The 40-hour requirement is realistic for most pilots, unlike for the private, where you typically need far more than 40 hours. But only the time under the hood counts, so you would typically get maybe 2 hours of hood time that counts toward your instrument rating out of a typical 2.4 or 2.5 hour training flight. So figure you'll need on average just 20 flights if you log 2.0 hours of hood time per flight. Now, you can save some money by doing part of the training in a flight school simulator. These are good for introducing pilots to some of the concepts they'll be learning. So if you do use a sim, I suggest doing it mostly in the earlier parts of your training. You can also log some of the 40 hours with just a safety pilot and no CFI on board. If you do that, I suggest you do that in the latter part of the training. If you do it before you get much flight training, you may just end up reinforcing some bad habits before you learn the proper ways to fly IFR. And as for ground school, you can use books, online computer courses, or an in-person ground school. I always recommend the ASA Instrument Oral Guide for preparing for the oral portion of the check ride. Alex, I hope this helps. And speaking of help, if you need any help whatsoever as you're thinking about maybe buying a Cirrus SR20, SR22, or SF50 Vision jet, or you're thinking about how do I learn how to fly one of these things safely, I've got lots of ideas and tips for you. Just give me a call, 650-967-2500, or go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. By the way, that's also the place where you can leave any listener questions like we just covered here. As you know, I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the world. Now, everyone who's ever written to me and has gotten an email back from me knows that I almost always thank you for listening to the show. And if I haven't done that recently, hey, thanks so much for listening. I greatly appreciate it. And if you would, please go ahead and show some of your aviation friends how they can listen as well. And if they don't know what a podcast is, just send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store where they can download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast app for iOS and Android. That is really the easiest way for people not familiar with podcasting to start listening to this show. In the App Store, just have them search for Aviation News Talk. And of course, those apps are free. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.